This place is considered to be one of the most haunted places in Japan and probably the most haunted place in Kyushu. If you're not familiar with Japan's geography, Kyushu is an island in the south, and it's actually where I'm originally from. Inunaki Mountain Pass, Inunaki Tunnel, and Inunaki Dam are all located in Miyawaka, Fukuoka Prefecture. If you're a fan of all things creepy, then I'm sure you've heard of this place one time or another. They have been the center of several paranormal encounters, urban legends, a horrific murder, and deadly accidents. This infamous spot isn't far from where we live, and we ventured out there to bring you today's episode. But before we get into it, if you're fascinated by Japan's horror stories, then make sure to subscribe, because this channel only brings you stories from my home country, Japan. I've scoured the Japanese online forums, dug up and translated all the stories into English for you to enjoy. Are you ready for the most comprehensive coverage of Inunaki? Let's begin. First, let's talk about Inunaki Toge, which literally translates to dog, cry, mountain pass. There are a few theories as to the origin of its name. Theory 1. Not even dogs could get over the ridge because of how dangerous and convoluted it is that they howled for help. Theory 2. A long time ago, a wolf made its way through Inunaki Ridge and came across a waterfall. No matter how hard it tried, it couldn't make it to the top, so it howled in sadness. Theory 3. A hunter took his dog into the forest one day, but couldn't get close to any of his prey because the dog wouldn't stop barking. He got so angry that he ended up shooting and killing the dog. Just then, a huge snake as long as 5 meters appeared in front of him, and the hunter realized that the dog had been warning him of this snake. He was guilt-ridden after this that he converted into a monk. The urban legend surrounding Inunaki village. There was a group of people living in this village from the Edo period, 1603 to 1867. These people were heavily discriminated against and were isolated from everyone else. They had to be self-sufficient by growing their own food and never stepped foot outside. This village can't be found on any map, and if you approach its entrance, there's a sign saying that the Japanese law does not apply from this point forward. If you go past it, someone wielding an axe will come after you. There's a rumor that a young couple went to this village and got killed when they entered it. This entire urban legend is exactly that, an urban legend. There was actually never a village called Inunaki Village, only a village called Inunaki Valley Village, which is now at the bottom of Inunaki Dam. When the city decided to build the dam, everyone living in this small village had to move away to neighboring areas. There's absolutely nothing untoward about this, apart from the sadness of those who had no choice but to leave their homes. Now, let's move on to today's main story, the horrific murder that happened at the Inunaki Tunnel back in 1988. December 7th, 1988, around 12 noon, the body's discovery. A passerby came across a gruesome sight approximately a kilometer from the entrance of Inunaki Tunnel. A thin man who looked to be about 20 years old, 170 centimeters, with black hair, was found burned, lying in a pool of blood. From what was left of his clothes, he was seen to be wearing a green jumper, jeans, white socks, and navy blue shoes. There were signs on the road of him running while still on fire and fell at the spot where he was eventually found. The police determined it had only been a few hours since he took his last breath. The police had to be open-minded and take into consideration that the man had taken his own life. However, there were too many inconsistencies to back up that theory. Firstly, the man seemed to have about 5 lacerations to his head, which looked like it had come from bumping into a hard object. The largest of these lacerations was about 8 centimeters in length. The pool of blood he was lying in resulted from these injuries, and the guardrails along the edge of the road were spattered in blood. At first glance, they couldn't determine what caused these injuries. Apart from signs that this man struggled on the ground, they discovered during the autopsy that he had soot in his lungs, which meant that he was alive when he was set on fire. Other oddities the police discovered was the fact that they couldn't find his right shoe and his sock was torn due to whatever struggle he encountered. The smell of gasoline was strong, signifying that he or someone else doused him in it before lighting him on fire. But there was nothing around him, no empty bottles, matches, or lighters, nothing that could have set the fire. His wallet and his license was also nowhere to be found. December 8, 1988. Arrests made. The body was identified on the afternoon the day after it was discovered. I will not be mentioning any real names to respect the victim and his family. He was only 20 years old and lived with his mother and grandmother. On the morning of the 6th, he dropped his mother off at her work and went to the steel mill where he worked. He clocked off around 5:30 p.m., and that was the last time anyone saw or heard from him. In the evening of the 7th, his mother was sick with worry when she saw on the news that a body had been discovered earlier that day. She was immediately overcome with dread and contacted the police saying that it might be her son. From there, they checked the body's fingerprints and his identity was confirmed. By the late afternoon of the 8th, the police found the man's car 22 kilometers from where the body was discovered. At around this point, the police were finally starting to dismiss the suicide theory. Not only did they fail to find any container that might have been filled with gasoline in the car, but they couldn't find any lighters or matches either. The car was found in the opposite direction of the victim's home, and after getting to know his personality and habits, it became more and more unrealistic that he might have taken his own life. The victim always went home straight after work, and he had no reasons to hurt himself. They found bloodstains in the boot of the car and on the passenger's side, those that were believed to be the victims. In the car, they also found hair that was dyed red, 2 types of cigarette butts, and multiple fingerprints. Then the police got a tip from farmers in the area that they had seen a car that looked like the victims on the morning of the 7th, and that there were 3 young men inside. From all of the above information and evidence, on the morning of December 9th, 2 days after the body was found, the police officially declared it a homicide. The police quickly arrested 5 individuals after running the fingerprints, and within the day, they all confessed to the killing. All 5 boys were minors. Of the 5, the one who was considered to be the leader was someone who was known to the victim. He was a 19-year-old male who was believed to be a minor player in a local gang. The rest had all been in trouble with the law by committing petty crimes and ranged in age between 16 and 19 years old. The leader was the worst of them all. He had been arrested 14 times since he was in middle school due to stealing and blackmailing, and had been institutionalized in juvenile detention centers 3 times. Before anything was known when the body was first discovered, some of the police and detectives involved in the case thought that maybe this guy was involved. That's how much this 19-year-old was known to the police. So what was the catalyst to this horrific crime? A car. The 19-year-old didn't own a car, but he felt absolutely no need to purchase one because if there was anyone around him when he needed a car, he'd just take it by force. The victims were always too afraid to report him to the police because of what might happen as a repercussion. This was the reason he got away with so much more than he should have. On the 6th, the day before this crime happened, him and his friend were already riding around in another car that he'd taken from an acquaintance. This friend, another 19-year-old, was one of the 5 that were arrested for this crime. Although they were enjoying this new ride, it wasn't what they wanted. You might be wondering why that is. It was because they had asked a middle school girl out on a date that night, these 2 19-year-olds. Don't even get me started on the age discrepancy. Anyway, the car they'd taken was a small truck which didn't look as cool and was somewhat inconvenient to drive around in for a date. As they were driving around, they came across the victim's car. He happened to be waiting at a red light and he was driving a Daihatsu Mira. a model that was a lot cooler than the truck they had. The two decided that this car was what they needed to impress the girl that night. When the leader saw that the driver was someone he'd known since they were kids, he knew without a doubt that the car would be his that night. He thought this because he knew that the victim was very soft-spoken and was weak. He wasn't the type to ever say no to a request, especially if it was coming from someone as tough as him. He parked the truck on the side of the road and approached the car. "Yo, look who it is. Hey, open the door for me." He forced his way into the car and started to tell the victim his dilemma. "So, I'm supposed to take a girl out tonight, but I've only got that shitty truck. I want to show off a bit, so let me use your car." Expecting a yes from the victim, he was caught off guard when the victim replied, My grandmother will get mad at me." As I mentioned earlier, the victim lived with his mother and grandmother. His grandfather died in the Burma War, and his grandmother raised his mother by herself. His mother divorced from his father after falling pregnant, and she too raised the victim as a single parent. The victim had a slight intellectual disability and was extremely introverted and had difficulty making friends. As such, his mother and grandmother worried about his future, but when the victim graduated high school, he got a job in a steel mill and he had been working tirelessly ever since. His grandmother couldn't be happier with the development, and along with his mother, they pooled what little savings they had to purchase a car so that he could drive to and from work. Knowing this, the victim couldn't give the car to someone who'd been so violent even when he was a kid and did nothing with his life but hurt others. He probably felt that he would never get his car back. The leader got pissed. "You gonna let me borrow it or not? Make up your fucking mind." My grandmother, she's gonna get... You trying to piss me off?" Something snapped within the 19-year-old and he punched the victim. "You're fucking 20 years old and you're crying over what your grandma might think? Fucking baby." Once he snapped, he couldn't stop. He needed the car and he wanted to impress that girl. The blood was pumping through his veins. The other 19-year-old joined in on the violence after moving the victim over to the passenger's side. Eventually, the victim started to bleed, which probably led to the bloodstains on the passenger's side when the car was found. Leaving the truck and still continuously punching the victim, they made their way to another kid's house. This kid was only 16. The purpose of this visit was to hold the victim captive because they were going to take his car and they didn't want him to cause any trouble. They called another kid to come help with holding the victim captive, and here enters another 16-year-old. While the two 16-year-olds kept watch over the victim, the two 19-year-olds went for their date. The 16-year-olds could only do as they were told. They beat up the victim some more to make the 19-year-olds proud, but they made one huge mistake. When the 19-year-olds still hadn't returned at midnight, they both fell asleep. At 2 a.m., making sure the two were dead asleep, the victim, having endured hours of torture, made a run for it. But luck wasn't on his side. The 19-year-olds got back from their date not long after and discovered that the victim wasn't there. They had another friend with them, a 17-year-old and the final player in this group of 5. They all climbed into the car and went out looking for the victim. They weren't searching aimlessly because the leader knew where the victim lived. He knew that the victim wouldn't be asking for help to a stranger because of his character, and assumed that he would probably be hiding in the dark somewhere. They found him running along the road approximately 2 kilometers from his own home. When the group of 5 boys found him, they chased after him relentlessly and recaptured him. They, and especially the leader, were pissed off. The violence escalated to a whole new level, and the punches to the face didn't stop. His face was already disfigured, and he was bleeding profusely, but none of them stopped. He was writhing and groaning in pain when the leader said, "Gotta kill him so he doesn't tell the police." Having been in youth detention centers 3 times before and in trouble with the law on numerous occasions, he didn't want to go back to that environment and didn't want to deal with the police. He was sure that they'd send him back to the detention center, so to avoid that from happening, he decided to kill the victim. Of course, the punishment for first-degree murder would have been a lot worse, but this guy wasn't the smartest tool in the shed, and he probably didn't think that far. The other 4 were followers and just as dumb, so no one tried to stop him. They stuffed the victim into the boot of his car and drove to a port in the city called Kanda, intending to throw the victim into the water and let him drown. Even after they got there, they continued to punch him. Once their hands started aching, they switched to whatever tools they could get their hands on, including throwing the spare tire at him. The victim pleaded and begged for them to stop, but none of them cared. He held onto the concrete wall of the port with unbelievable strength, not allowing himself to fall into the water. Someone took a bar and smashed his hands. It ripped his hand open, his bones poked through. Blood poured out and the victim seemed to momentarily lose consciousness, but his hands never lost its grip. Seeing this happen, one of the boys felt some kind of empathy and said, "Why don't we stop now? I feel bad." To which the leader replied, "You're part of this. You'll get caught for attempted murder and you'll go down with the rest of us. If they catch you, you'll never get out, so you better quit whining and finish this." Just then, they saw a boat approaching from afar with its lights on. Realizing they didn't want to be caught red-handed, they stopped what they were doing and pulled the victim up and threw him back into the boot. That didn't mean they were done, though. As they were driving, they conversed about the next place to finish what they started. "Can't go to the pier, too much traffic there. How about throwing him into a dam? Wasn't there one near here? Yeah, how about Bikimaru Dam?" They started heading in that direction, but again they stopped because they were worried that the body might float up to the surface if they dumped the victim there. After contemplating for a while longer, someone said, "How about burning him so that no one recognizes who he is? If we douse him in gasoline, he'll burn like hell." According to their confession, they all knew the victim could hear this entire conversation. In fact, they all made sure they talked loud enough so that he could hear it all. The victim was crying for his life and from pain in the boot as the leader yelled out directly to him, "Hey, don't worry, we'll put you out of your misery soon." December 7th, 1988, 8 a.m. They stopped at a petrol station. One of them told the attendant that his bike ran out of petrol and to put some in a bottle. At a later interview, the attendant stated that that was how they got a liter of gasoline for the crime. He could tell that they were up to no good, yelling out obscenities to a female staff, but no way could he have fathomed that they would use it to murder someone in cold blood. Back in the car, the leader wanted to make sure they were all equally responsible for what was about to occur so that no one would go to the police. They decided to play rock, scissors, paper to determine who would pour the gasoline on the victim, who would light him on fire, etc. Just then, the 17-year-old spoke up saying that he wanted to pour the petrol. According to him, he didn't want to be the one to light the victim on fire. Then, another one of the boys said, "I'll light up the tissue." Again, not wanting to be the one who directly lit the victim. At the end of this sickening conversation, the leader himself became the one to do the unspeakable final act. The last location chosen was the Inunaki tunnel. It was a quiet place with barely any traffic and was already a place that was at the center of several ghost sightings. It was a very eerie place and still is. 10 a.m. They pulled the victim out of the boot, and the 17-year-old wasted no time to pour gasoline over him when the victim let out the loudest yell. The 17-year-old shrunk back. He couldn't understand where and how the victim got the strength to scream out like that when he had been beaten relentlessly for the past several hours. Just as the 17-year-old shrunk back in shock, the victim ran into the mountains at tremendous speed. Everyone started to chase after him, but they couldn't see him anywhere. If the victim had been able to run to safety or hide until the 5 boys gave up, he might have lived to today. Yes, he probably would have had PTSD and other side effects due to the ordeal, but he would have lived. The victim's will to live and fight was so strong that he managed to escape from the grip of death a second time. But it was never meant to be. "Hey, we're sorry. Promise we won't hurt you anymore. We'll take you home, so come out." This was a blatant lie. Anyone could have seen through it. But the victim was all too trusting and he came out from hiding. They captured him again. 4 of them held on tight so that he couldn't run away again, while the 5th used duct tape to tape his hands and legs together. They used a shirt from one of the boys and stuffed it into his mouth. Being tied up and gagged, they made the victim kneel on the road as he cried and tried to talk. They poured the rest of the gasoline over him. They lit a tissue on fire. Then they threw it at him. He went up in flames in a split second. He writhed in pain, and with duct tape melted from the fire, he started to run, bumping into the guardrails as he did so. Eventually, he collapsed and stopped moving altogether. But the 5 weren't done yet. After the victim stopped moving, they used a rock or some other heavy object to bash the victim's head in. The lacerations found on his head probably came from these final acts. There is some information floating around the net that the cause of death was from blood loss due to blunt force trauma to the head, but this is not the case. Being burnt to death was the actual cause of death. The 5 climbed into the car and left the scene, but they went back a total of 3 times every 5 minutes to double and triple check that the victim was actually dead. They burned the victim's driver's license and smashed his watch to pieces in hopes of avoiding and at the very least delaying the identification process. Regardless of these measures, the boy took the car out that same day and went for drinks. When they got back, they didn't bother wiping down the car, even though it was full of bloodstains and fingerprints. They locked the car and left it on the side of the road. According to one of the boys during interrogation, they were planning to use the car again in the future. So, no need to clean the car up. They're clearly tremendously stupid. Not only that, but when the leader got back home where he lived with his mother, he said to her, "The police haven't come by, have they? Because I just burnt someone to death." Back at the victim's house, his mother and grandmother were more than just heartbroken with the terrible news. His uncle expressed his anger and frustration of not being able to retaliate in any way, as he stated to the press, "If the law allowed me, I want to do to those 5 boys what they did to my nephew." The older sister of the 19-year-old leader brought him into the police station, at which point the boy was visibly shaking. He could only have 1 bite of food from the evening of the 9th to the morning of the 10th, stating that he couldn't bring himself to eat when he thought about the victim. The other 4 involved were also beginning to voice out their regrets. But that was where any expression of normal human emotion or empathy started and ended. By the next day, they were all eating their food, and during interrogations, they all sat there with a smug face, sometimes grinning as they told the police what they'd done. "I didn't actually kill the guy, so why am I even here? It's his fault because he didn't want to lend us his car." Maybe we can take a little bit of comfort to hear that the leader had a rude awakening. He asked the police, "So how long will I go away for this time?" He knew he was a minor and thought that he wouldn't have to spend too much time in prison because of it. He was handed a life sentence due to the nature of this heinous crime. On March 8, 1991, his appeal was denied and his original sentence was upheld. His excuse of poor upbringing and expressing his so-called remorse while in jail did nothing to ease his sentence. The judge declared that a crime of this nature was unprecedented and that the leader played the pivotal role instigating every single action in this case. Therefore, the responsibility laid most heavily on him. However, the rest of the 4 had sentences that were 4, 5, 8, and 10 years, which in my opinion was way too light. It is rumored that after being released, 3 of them have joined gangs, one of them climbing up the ladder within the group to the top. This guy apparently still brags that he was one of the 5 boys back in the day. No one can confirm whether or not this rumor is true, but it most likely is. Other tragedies that occurred in the area. 1. On January 13th, 2000, a woman's body was discovered at the Inunaki Dam. There isn't any information on how she met her demise, but judging from the fact that she was skeletonized, it can be assumed that she was there for a fair while before being discovered. Could she have committed suicide, or was her body thrown into the dam to cover up another crime? 2. On the early morning of February 10th, 2001, a group of 5 boys who were driving back home after visiting Inunaki out of morbid curiosity had a head-on collision with a truck. A 15-year-old, 2 17-year-olds, and an 18-year-old all died. The 5th boy, who was 15 years old, had serious injuries. The truck driver, aged 37, escaped with minor injuries. The group were 5 young boys, just like the 5 that were involved in the horrendous murder, and some believe that this accident was caused by some kind of evil omen at the tunnel. 3. In 1992, there was an accident where a car carrying 10 teenaged boys ran into a pole. There were no signs of the car brakes being used. The driver died, and the others in the car escaped with a few broken bones. From what I've shared with you so far, it is no wonder why this area is feared by many. Paranormal activity has been documented well before 1988, but all these additional cases have solidified this fear. This brings us to the last leg of this video. Let me share with you a couple of creepy stories involving the area. They are all deemed to be true. 1. The woman in the white dress. Over 20 years ago, a man was invited by his uni friends to go visit the tunnel. The 3 headed out in a car. The fog was heavy this night, and even with the headlights on, they could only see a few meters ahead. One of them, Kenji, had been to this tunnel several times before. He liked visiting haunted places, but he'd never seen any ghosts. On this day, though, something was different. He was overcome with a feeling of dread and goosebumps all over his body as soon as they turned into the road where the tunnel was located. They saw the tunnel appear in the fog, and they parked the car and hopped out. Back then, there were no concrete blocks blocking either entrance, so people were able to walk straight through. The 3 uni guys entered the tunnel and started to walk. When they got to the midpoint, one of them said, "Let's race to the other side." Kenji, who had been feeling uneasy, didn't feel like playing games, so they kept walking. When the exit started to appear, Kenji saw what looked like a woman standing there. She was wearing a white dress, but there was a black mist around her head, so he couldn't see her face. The woman in the white began moving towards them, but she wasn't walking. It looked like she was gliding towards them, as if she was skating across the ground. Kenji immediately turned around and ran towards the car, dragging the other 2 by their arms. They jumped into the car and sped out of there. Just as they were about to exit the road, one of them let out a scream. Kenji was way too scared to turn around or to ask what happened, so he kept his eyes glued straight ahead. They went to a diner when they got to the city, and once everyone had calmed down, they began talking about what just happened. All 3 of them saw the woman in white with the black mist covering the face. Kenji then asked the other 2 which one of them suggested racing to the other end. Both of them looked at one another and, with frozen expressions, slowly shook their heads. They all sat in silence while they digested this piece of information. Then Kenji finally asked, "Right, so when one of you screamed when we were getting out of there, what did you see?" And his friend replied, I saw her. I saw her staring at me in the side mirror. She didn't have any whites in her eyes. They were just pitch black." Needless to say, after this experience, none of them ever went back to the Inunaki tunnel. 2. When Mom called the payphone. There's a payphone at the entrance of a car park which leads to the Inunaki Dam on one side and the mountains on the other. A bunch of uni guys were taken by force to the Inunaki Tunnel. The one who dragged them all there was a year or two above them and enjoyed hazing the first-year students. This was one of those times. 5 of them got squeezed into the small payphone booth. The oldest guy threw firecrackers into the booth and laughed as he watched all of them screaming and trying to get out. All of a sudden, the phone started ringing. It scared all of them and they all flew out of the booth. No one could understand why the payphone was ringing, but one of the first-year students, Tsuyoshi, said he'll answer it. He picked up the receiver. On the other end was Tsuyoshi's mother. She screamed into the phone, "Tsuyoshi, what are you doing? Why did you go there? What am I going to do?" And the line went dead. The strange thing was that Tsuyoshi's mum didn't know they were all heading to the tunnel. It was a time when mobile phones didn't exist, so no one could have called her to let her know. Everyone freaked out and they all decided to head home. When Tsuyoshi got home, he discovered his mum dead on the floor with her hand gripping the phone. To this day, we still don't know what happened to her. The movie. On February 7th, 2020, a movie titled Inunakimura, which translates to Inunaki Village, was released. After its release, many people decided to visit the actual location, and now it is impossible to go inside the tunnel. The government upped the security, and it is ill-advised to go there now because you might get into real trouble. The footage I shared with you today was taken before its release, so the tunnel was still accessible by climbing over the concrete blocks. Hey guys, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you learned something new about Inunaki today. Next week, we'll be bringing you some more creepy stories, so make sure you come back then. Thanks and see you soon.